Today, we are breaking down one of the most chaotic months in recent memory, January 2026. Let me tell you, geopolitics, markets, the entire balance of power, it all got thrown into a blender. It happened so fast that just trying to keep track of it all felt, well, impossible. So, let's try to make some sense of it.
You know, to really get the vibe of the month, you got to see this quote from the EU's foreign policy chief. Now, she might have been joking, but the sentiment was spot on. The sheer volume of information, the speed of it all, it just left everyone feeling completely burnt out. It perfectly captures the sense of overload that really defined January.
So here's how we're going to break down this whirlwind of a month. First, we'll talk about that overwhelming flood of information. Then, we'll dive into two massive geopolitical flashpoints that really shook things up. After that, we'll see how the markets reacted, tackle a really surprising thought experiment about China's true power, and wrap up with a pretty chilling final warning.
Okay, first things first, we have to set the scene. The main story of January 2026 wasn't just one single event. It was this absolute tidal wave of news hitting us from every direction. So the real challenge wasn't just knowing what was happening, but trying to figure out how on earth all these pieces fit together.
All right, now let's zoom in on two specific events that sent shockwaves across the globe. First up, a transformation in Venezuela that happened at like lightning speed. And second, a diplomatic crisis over Greenland that, according to the author, delivered a blow to a cornerstone of Western security, a blow that was, well, mortal. What is just wild here is the speed of it all. Think about this. On January 3rd, there's an operation to capture Nicolas Maduro. A week later, a new law completely opens up their oil industry. Just 2 days after that, the U.S. starts easing restrictions. And the result? By the middle of the month, Venezuela is getting 30% more for its oil. By the 26th, American Airlines is flying there again. I mean, a complete geopolitical 180 in just 23 days. Unbelievable.
The second flashpoint? Well, it was a diplomatic dumpster fire. It was sparked by really inflammatory language like this, a quote from Donald Trump on Truth Social, and it was aimed at a key NATO ally, the UK. This kind of talk was just part of a bigger escalating fight over Greenland, and the author argues this was the exact moment the alliance really started to crack.
And the author doesn't mince words about this. Their conclusion is blunt. The mix of that harsh rhetoric and the geopolitical fight over Greenland dealt a mortal wound to NATO. The alliance didn't just vanish overnight, obviously, but for all intents and purposes, its foundation had crumbled.
Okay, so with all this chaos erupting on the world stage, you have to ask, right? What were the financial markets doing? Well, these huge geopolitical shifts sent immediate ripples through some key assets, specifically the US dollar and gold. Let's take a look.
Before we go any further, just a real quick primer on something called the DXY, or the US Dollar Index. It's basically a report card for the dollar. It just measures how strong the dollar is against a bunch of other major world currencies. If the DXY goes up, the dollar's stronger. If it goes down, the dollar's weaker. Simple as that. This is going to be important for what's next.
Now, this is where the author brings up a really interesting, kind of counterintuitive idea. When you hear the administration talk about a strong dollar, they don't necessarily mean a high number on that DXY index. What they mean is they want the dollar to stay strong as the world's reserve currency, the money everyone else on the planet uses for business. And the key insight is that you can actually have a dollar that's a bit weaker against, say, the euro or the yen, while still holding on to that global top spot. In fact, a slightly weaker dollar might actually be part of the plan.
And here is the proof in the pudding. A weaker US dollar is actually a massive help to emerging markets. Why? Well, a lot of them have debt that's in dollars, but their income is in their own local currency. So when the dollar weakens, that debt gets a lot easier for them to pay back. And just look at this number. January saw nearly $50 billion in new debt from emerging markets. That's one of the strongest months in history.
At the very same time all this was happening with the dollar, the prices of gold and silver just went through the roof. The author suggests a few reasons this might have happened. First off, gold prices have been tracking the growth in the money supply pretty closely for a while. Second, it could have been a massive short squeeze, where people who bet the price would go down all got forced to buy at once, which just shoots the price up even faster. And finally, you have potential export bans out of China that could be squeezing the available supply.
All right, now we get to what is honestly the most mind-bending part of this whole analysis. The author was getting challenged online by some critics about their views on China's strength, specifically about its population numbers.
So they decided to lean into the criticism and run a pretty fascinating thought experiment.
So here's the question the critics were posing. They were arguing that China's real population is way smaller than the official 1.4 billion number. So the author says, okay, fine, let's play this game. For the sake of argument, let's just assume China's population is only 700 million. What would that actually mean?
Let's start with electricity. Now look, China's total power production is already way bigger than the US and the EU combined. We know that. But here's the kicker. If you cut their population in half, their production per person suddenly becomes higher than in the US. So in this scenario, China isn't just a massive energy producer. It would become the most energy-rich nation per capita on Earth.
And it's not just with power. The story repeats itself. With a smaller population, China would have more than 2.5 mobile lines for every single person. That's more than double the rate in the US. Their car production per person would also be way higher. You slice the data this way, and you see a picture of a hyper-productive, super advanced society.
And here is the final piece of the puzzle: wealth. If we adjust their GDP for what money can actually buy in their country, that's called purchasing power parity. Their wealth per person jumps to almost $60,000. Look at the chart. That puts them right on the heels of a developed European country like France. That's a huge deal.
So here's the big twist, right? The very argument that was meant to prove China was weaker actually ends up proving the complete opposite. If their population is smaller, it means they've basically already caught up to the developed world in terms of wealth and infrastructure for each person. It actually makes the case for their economic power even stronger, not weaker. But just when you think the chaos of January might be settling down, the author closes with one final, sobering warning. There's another shadow of conflict gathering on the horizon. The author gets pretty direct here, expressing some deep concern over all the talk that was heating up around Iran. They make it very clear they are not supportive of what they see happening. They wrap up this point by quoting the political scientist John Mearsheimer, arguing that getting into a conflict with Iran is just flat out not in the United States' national interest. It's a really stark warning against repeating the mistakes of the past.
So, where does that leave us? After a single month of shattered alliances, rocked markets, and a total rethinking of global power, we're left with this question. If January 2026 taught us anything, it's that the world can change in the blink of an eye. The only question now is, what's the next spark?